October 1st, 1993. It was a quiet Friday night in the peaceful city of Petaluma, California. Families across the neighborhood were settling into their evening routines. Children were enjoying the start of the weekend. Televisions glowed inside comfortable homes. And nothing suggested that one ordinary sleepover would soon become one of the most heartbreaking child abduction cases in American history. Inside a modest home on 13th Street, 12-year-old Polly Klaas was doing what countless children did on weekend nights. She was having a sleepover with two of her closest friends. The girls had spent the evening laughing, talking, eating snacks, and watching movies. For Polly, it was simply another fun night with friends. There was no fear, no danger, no reason to believe someone was watching from outside. Polly was known as a bright, kind-hearted, and imaginative young girl. She loved acting, writing stories, and making people laugh. Friends describe her as caring and creative, while her family remember her infectious smile and gentle personality. She had dreams of the future that any 12-year-old might have. She was looking forward to school, spending time with friends, and growing up. Nothing about that evening hinted that her future was about to be stolen. As the night grew later, the girls changed into their pajamas and settled inside Polly's bedroom. A movie played quietly in the background. The atmosphere was relaxed. Outside, the neighborhood had become silent. Parents believed their children were safe inside their homes. But sometime after 10:30 p.m., everything changed. Without warning, a man entered the house. According to later court testimony, the intruder quietly made his way toward Polly's bedroom. His face was partially concealed. He carried a knife. The bedroom door opened. Within seconds, three frightened girls found themselves staring at a complete stranger. The room fell silent. The man ordered the girls not to scream. Terrified, they froze. The intruder demanded money. Polly and her friends explained that they didn't have any. What happened next would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Instead of leaving, the man made a horrifying decision. He ordered Polly to stand up. He tied her hands. Then, at knife point, he forced the terrified 12-year-old girl out of her own bedroom. Her two friends remained inside, powerless, too frightened to intervene. They watched as their friend disappeared into the darkness. It was the last time they would ever see Polly alive. Once the intruder had left with Polly, the girls remained frozen in fear. For a few terrifying moments, they were afraid he might come back. When they finally realized the house had become quiet, they rushed to tell Polly's mother, Eve Klaas, what had happened. The panic was immediate. A child had been kidnapped directly from her own bedroom, inside her own home. It was almost impossible to believe. Within minutes, Petaluma Police Department officers arrived at the house. The home was secured as a crime scene. Detectives began interviewing the two young witnesses, while forensic specialists searched every room for evidence. Investigators quickly realized this was unlike anything their community had experienced. A masked intruder had entered an occupied home, confronted three children with a knife, and abducted one of them without leaving obvious clues behind. The urgency could not have been greater. Every passing minute reduced the chances of finding Polly safely. Officers immediately broadcast descriptions of the suspect and began searching roads leading out of Petaluma. Nearby police departments were notified. Road patrols increased. Investigators hoped someone might have seen a suspicious vehicle leaving the neighborhood. Meanwhile, Polly's family could only wait. The house that had been filled with laughter just an hour earlier had become the center of an unfolding nightmare. Detectives understood something deeply troubling. Child abductions by strangers are among the most time-sensitive investigations in law enforcement. The first few hours often determine the outcome. They had no idea who the masked man was, where he had taken Polly, or whether she was still alive. As dawn approached, news of the kidnapping spread across California. By sunrise, what had begun as a local police investigation was rapidly becoming a national emergency. Thousands of volunteers would soon join the search. The FBI would become involved. America would watch every development. But at that moment, one terrifying question remained unanswered. Who was the masked man who walked into a little girl's bedroom and disappeared into the night with Polly Klaas? Before America knew her name, before television stations interrupted their regular programming, Before thousands of volunteers searched forests and fields hoping to find her alive, Polly Klaas was simply a 12-year-old girl with a bright imagination and a future filled with dreams. She wasn't famous. She wasn't the subject of headlines. She was a daughter, a friend, a student, a child whose greatest concerns were school, friends, and the next adventure waiting around the corner. That is exactly what made her story so heartbreaking. Born in 1981, Polly Hannah Klaas grew up in Petaluma, California, a quiet city north of San Francisco known for its family neighborhoods, historic downtown, and close-knit community. It was a kind of place where children rode bicycles through the streets, neighbors recognized one another, and parents believed their kids could safely enjoy childhood. For Polly, Petaluma wasn't simply where she lived. It was home. She lived with her mother, Eve Nickel, who raised Polly after separating from her father. Although life wasn't always easy, the bond between mother and daughter was exceptionally close. Friends often described them as a team. Eve encouraged Polly's creativity, supported her interests, and did everything she could to provide a happy and stable childhood. Polly adored her mother. They spent countless evenings talking, laughing, reading together, and planning for the future. Like many single parents, Eve worked hard to give her daughter every opportunity possible. She believed in Polly's dreams, and Polly believed her mother could solve almost any problem. That trust made what happened on October 1st, 1993, even more devastating. Polly attended Petaluma Junior High School, where teachers remembered her as an intelligent, curious, and respectful student. She wasn't known for causing trouble. Instead, she stood out because of her creativity and enthusiasm. She enjoyed learning, loved reading stories, and had an active imagination that seemed to turn ordinary moments into exciting adventures. Her classmates remembered someone who was friendly and welcoming. She had a natural ability to make others feel comfortable. Whether she was sitting in class, talking with friends during lunch, or participating in school activities, Polly's warm personality made her someone people genuinely enjoyed being around. But perhaps nothing brought Polly more happiness than acting in theater. She loved performing. She enjoyed pretending to be different characters, memorizing lines, and stepping onto a stage where imagination became reality. Family members recalled that she wasn't shy when it came to acting. She embraced every opportunity to perform, whether it was a school production or simply entertaining family members at home. Polly's confidence and enthusiasm were impossible to ignore. Those who watched her perform believed she had real talent. Acting wasn't just a hobby. It was one of her biggest dreams. She imagined herself continuing to perform as she grew older. Like many children, she believed the future was full of endless possibilities. Outside school and theater, Polly enjoyed the simple pleasures of childhood. She loved spending weekends with friends, hosting sleepovers, watching movies, listening to music, laughing until late at night. The sleepover on October 1st wasn't unusual. It was exactly the kind of evening 12-year-old girls across America enjoyed every weekend. No one imagined it would become the final night of her life. Friends later described Polly as caring, funny, and thoughtful. She wasn't someone who wanted to hurt people's feelings. If someone felt left out, Polly often tried to include them. If someone was upset, she was usually among the first to offer comfort. Those qualities made her deeply loved by classmates, teachers, and neighbors alike. To the people who knew her best, Polly wasn't remembered because of tragedy. She was remembered because of kindness, her laughter, her creativity, her generosity. She made people smile. That is the memory her family wanted the world to hold on to. Not the crime, but the child. The relationship between Polly and her mother remained the center of her life. Eve later spoke publicly about how deeply connected they had been. They shared hopes for Polly's future, talked about school, discussed acting, planned holidays and birthdays. Like every parent, Eve imagined watching her daughter grow into adulthood, graduations, college, a career, perhaps one day a family of her own. Those dreams disappeared in a single night. The Petaluma community also embraced Polly as one of its own. Following her disappearance, neighbors organized search parties almost immediately. Local businesses displayed missing person posters. Schools held prayer gatherings. Volunteers from across California traveled to help search for the missing 12-year-old. The response reflected something powerful. People didn't simply know Polly's name. They cared about her. She represented every child, every daughter, every family. As the investigation expanded, millions of Americans would come to know Polly Klaas through television reports and newspaper headlines. But those closest to her hope people would never forget who she truly was. Not merely a victim, not merely a missing child, but a bright, talented young girl with dreams, laughter, and an entire life still waiting to be lived. That memory would soon become the driving force behind one of the largest child searches in American history. Because while investigators searched for clues, an entire nation was searching for Polly. The moment Petaluma Police Department confirmed that 12-year-old Polly Klaas had been abducted from her own bedroom, officers understood they were dealing with every parent's worst nightmare. This was not a child who had wandered away. She hadn't run off after an argument. She had been taken by force from the safety of her own home while two friends watched in terror. Every minute mattered. Within moments of arriving at the Klaas residence, officers secured the house as a crime scene. Detectives interviewed Polly's two friends separately, hoping to gather every possible detail about the masked intruder. They asked about his height, his voice, the clothes he wore, the knife he carried. Even the smallest observation could become the clue that solved the case. Meanwhile, patrol officers flooded the streets surrounding Petaluma. Roadblocks were considered. Descriptions of the suspect were broadcast to neighboring law enforcement agencies. Officers searched nearby parks, wooded areas, abandoned buildings, and rural roads leading out of Sonoma County. The hope was that Polly might still be nearby. Perhaps the kidnapper had abandoned a vehicle. Perhaps someone had witnessed something suspicious. Perhaps there was still time to save her. As the hours passed, the search expanded rapidly. Detectives knew that stranger child abductions are among the most urgent investigations in law enforcement. The first 24 hours are often the most critical. Waiting was not an option. By the following morning, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, officially joined the investigation, bringing additional agents, specialized resources, and extensive experience in child abduction cases. The FBI worked alongside the Petaluma Police Department, the Sonoma County Sheriff's Office, the California Highway Patrol, and numerous other agencies. The investigation quickly became a coordinated operation involving local, state, and federal law enforcement. It was one of the largest child search operations California had ever seen. But police officers were not the only people searching. The Petaluma community responded with extraordinary determination. As news of Polly's disappearance spread, hundreds of volunteers arrived to help. Within days, those hundreds became thousands. Neighbors left work early. Students skipped weekend plans. Church groups organized search parties. Local businesses donated food, water, and supplies. People who had never met Polly traveled from surrounding counties simply because they wanted to help bring one little girl home. Search teams walked mile after mile through forests, vineyards, open fields, riverbanks, and rural backroads. Mounted search units covered terrain inaccessible to vehicles. Specially trained search dogs attempted to follow Polly's scent. Helicopters searched from above while officers checked drainage ditches, abandoned structures, and isolated areas. Every location where a child might possibly be hidden was carefully examined. Yet despite the enormous effort, there was no sign of Polly. As the investigation continued, the story quickly captured the attention of the national media. Television stations interrupted regular programming. Major newspapers placed Polly's photograph on their front pages. News helicopters flew over Petaluma. Daily press conferences informed millions of Americans about the latest developments. The image of a smiling 12-year-old girl with curly brown hair soon became one of the most recognizable faces in the United States. The country watched and hoped. Parents hugged their children a little tighter. Communities across America organized candlelight vigils. Schools discussed personal safety with students. Polly's disappearance was no longer just a California story. It had become a national tragedy. One of the most powerful symbols of the search was the appearance of missing person posters. Volunteers printed thousands of flyers featuring Polly's photograph and description. They were taped to storefront windows, telephone poles, schools, gas stations, shopping malls, airports, bus terminals. Even hundreds of miles from California, People recognized Polly's face. The message was simple. Have you seen Polly Klaas? Every poster represented hope. Hope that someone, somewhere, had seen something. Hope that one phone call might bring Polly home. The investigation also received remarkable support from public figures. Celebrities, athletes, television personalities, and community leaders publicly appealed for information. Their involvement brought even greater national attention to the case and encouraged millions of Americans to remain alert. People who had never heard of Petaluma now knew Polly's name. As public concern grew, so did the reward fund. Businesses, private citizens, charitable organizations, and anonymous donors contributed money in the hope that someone with crucial information would come forward. The reward eventually reached hundreds of thousands of dollars, becoming one of the largest offered in an American child abduction case at the time. Investigators hoped the financial incentive might persuade someone to break their silence. Perhaps a witness had seen the kidnapper's vehicle. Perhaps someone recognized the description but was afraid to speak. The reward offered another chance. Another reason for the truth to come forward. Weeks passed, then months. Despite thousands of volunteer hours, hundreds of investigators, national media attention, FBI involvement, and one of the largest missing child searches in American history, Polly Klaas remained missing. For her family, every passing day became more painful than the last. Every ringing telephone brought hope. Every unanswered lead brought heartbreak. Experienced detectives knew something deeply unsettling. Someone had taken Polly. Someone knew exactly what had happened after she was forced out of her bedroom that October night. The question was no longer whether the kidnapper had made a mistake. It was whether investigators could find that mistake before the trail disappeared forever. Then, as detectives continued examining evidence and interviewing witnesses, a dangerous repeat offender quietly entered their investigation. A man whose violent past had already brought him into contact with the criminal justice system. His name was Richard Allen Davis, and he was about to become the focus of one of the largest manhunts in modern American criminal history. As the days following Polly Klaas's disappearance turned into weeks, one terrifying reality became impossible to ignore. Somewhere, a dangerous offender was still free. Detectives knew they weren't simply searching for a missing child anymore. They were hunting a predator who had entered a family home, threatened children with a knife, and disappeared into the darkness without leaving an obvious trail. The investigation had become one of the largest criminal inquiries in California's history. Every hour brought new information. Every hour brought new challenges. The first priority was preserving the crime scene inside the Klaas home. Forensic specialists carefully examined Polly's bedroom, searching for fingerprints, shoe impressions, fibers, hairs, and any trace the intruder might have left behind. Nothing was considered insignificant. Every surface was photographed. Every object was documented. Every possible piece of evidence was collected. Unlike television dramas, crime scenes rarely produce one dramatic clue that immediately identifies a suspect. Instead, investigators gather dozens or even hundreds of small pieces of evidence that must later be assembled into a complete picture. That was exactly what detectives hoped would happen here. Meanwhile, investigators conducted lengthy witness interviews with the two girls who had been in Polly's bedroom that night. Although they were understandably traumatized, both girls provided remarkably important information. They described the intruder's build, his approximate height, the knife he carried, the way he spoke. They also remembered that his face had been partially covered, making identification extremely difficult. Even so, detectives believed these details could help narrow the search. Specially trained forensic artists worked with the witnesses to create a composite sketch of the suspect. Hour after hour, investigators adjusted facial features, clothing, and other characteristics based on the girls' memories. When the sketch was completed, it was released to the public through newspapers and television broadcasts across California. Within hours, thousands of people had seen the image. Police hoped someone would recognize the man, perhaps a neighbor, a co-worker, a family member. Someone had to know who he was. The public response was immediate. Telephone lines at the Petaluma Police Department were flooded with calls. Some people believed they recognized the face. Others reported suspicious individuals who resembled the composite. Every tip had to be investigated. At the same time, Another important lead emerged. Several witnesses reported seeing a white vehicle in the neighborhood around the time of Polly's abduction. Descriptions varied slightly. Some believed it was an older white sedan. Others remembered a compact white car. Because witness memories are not always identical, detectives carefully compared every report. Investigators traced vehicle registrations, interviewed owners, examined maintenance records. Thousands of white vehicles across Northern California had to be considered. It was an enormous task, yet detectives could not afford to ignore even one possibility. As media coverage intensified, the number of potential suspects grew rapidly. Every day, investigators received dozens of new tips. People reported suspicious neighbors, former classmates, known offenders, strangers seen driving through Petaluma. The investigation eventually generated hundreds of potential suspects. Each name had to be checked. Each alibi had to be verified. Each lead consumed valuable time and investigative resources. Many suspects were quickly eliminated. Some had been working miles away. Others had witnesses confirming their whereabouts. Several individuals voluntarily provided fingerprints or other evidence that ruled them out completely. Although frustrating, eliminating innocent people was just as important as identifying the guilty one. It ensured investigators remained focused on evidence rather than assumptions. Unfortunately, the investigation also produced countless false leads. Some callers genuinely wanted to help but had mistaken identities. Others reported rumors that proved impossible to verify. A few individuals deliberately provided false information, forcing detectives to spend precious hours chasing stories that led nowhere. Every false lead delayed the investigation. But detectives had no choice. They had to examine every credible possibility. What if one seemingly unimportant call turned out to be the breakthrough? As the weeks passed, fear spread across California. Parents who had once allowed children to ride bicycles alone or play outside until sunset suddenly changed their routines. Sleepovers were canceled. Children were escorted to school. Families installed stronger locks and security lights. Communities organized neighborhood watch groups. Polly's kidnapping had shattered a basic assumption shared by millions of Americans, that children were safest inside their own homes. If a stranger could enter a bedroom and abduct a child while two friends watched helplessly, where was any child truly safe? The emotional impact reached far beyond Petaluma. Across the country, parents watched daily news reports with growing anxiety. Schools discussed personal safety. Law enforcement agencies reviewed child abduction procedures. The case had become a national symbol of every family's worst fear. Meanwhile, the investigation continued expanding. The FBI, Petaluma Police Department, California Department of Justice, Sonoma County Sheriff's Office, and numerous other agencies shared intelligence and resources. Evidence from the crime scene was repeatedly re-examined. Known violent offenders were investigated. Parolees living in Northern California were reviewed. Detectives began comparing Polly's case with similar crimes committed in previous years. Behavioral experts studied the offender's actions. What kind of criminal enters an occupied home, threatens children with a knife, and abducts one victim without leaving behind obvious evidence? The profile suggested someone with a history of violence, someone willing to take enormous risks, someone who had likely committed serious crimes before. Investigators believed they were not looking for an inexperienced offender. They were looking for a seasoned predator. What they didn't yet know was just how close they were. Hidden among thousands of names, one man, already known to the criminal justice system, had quietly escaped serious attention. A repeat violent offender, a career criminal, a man whose record stretched back years. His name was Richard Allen Davis. And within weeks, investigators would discover that they had been hunting one of California's most dangerous repeat offenders all along. As investigators followed thousands of leads across California, one name remained hidden among countless files. It wasn't a famous name. It wasn't someone dominating the news. It was simply another career criminal who had spent much of his adult life moving in and out of prison. That man was Richard Allen Davis. At first, detectives had no reason to believe Davis was connected to Polly Klaas's disappearance. He was only one of many offenders whose background was reviewed as investigators searched for a dangerous stranger. But as the evidence slowly developed, police would discover that they were not dealing with a first-time offender. They were dealing with a man whose violent past had repeatedly brought him to the attention of law enforcement. Richard Allen Davis was born in 1954 and had accumulated a lengthy criminal record long before Polly Klaas disappeared. Court records show convictions involving burglary, robbery, assault, and kidnapping-related offenses, along with repeated violations of parole. Over the years, Davis spent much of his adult life inside correctional facilities rather than building a stable career or family life. Each time he was released, he soon found himself back in trouble with the law. His criminal history revealed a disturbing pattern: violence, escalation, disregard for the rights and safety of others. Investigators would later discover that Davis had repeatedly demonstrated behavior suggesting he posed a serious risk to the public. Despite numerous arrests and prison sentences, those earlier convictions had not permanently removed him from society. Like many repeat offenders, he was released after serving portions of his sentences under California's parole system. One of the most significant facts investigators uncovered was that Richard Allen Davis had been released on parole only months before Polly Klaas was abducted. He had once again returned to the community after completing another prison term. To the public, he appeared to be just another recently released parolee attempting to rebuild his life. But behind that appearance was a man with decades of violent criminal behavior. Davis lived a troubled and unstable lifestyle. He frequently moved between temporary residences, relied on short-term work, and maintained few stable relationships. Investigators later describe him as someone who drifted from place to place, making it difficult to establish consistent routines. That instability complicated the investigation. Without a fixed pattern of daily activity, tracing his movements required extensive detective work. During the early stages of the Polly Klaas investigation, Davis was not immediately identified as the primary suspect. This wasn't because investigators ignored him. Rather, they were facing an overwhelming number of potential suspects. Thousands of tips poured in from across California. Hundreds of convicted offenders were reviewed. Every lead required time, manpower, and evidence. Davis was one name among many. At that point, detectives had no direct forensic evidence connecting him to the kidnapping. As a result, attention was temporarily focused elsewhere. Looking back, investigators later acknowledged that the sheer size of the investigation made it impossible to immediately prioritize every offender who matched parts of the developing profile. With thousands of active leads arriving each week, difficult decisions had to be made about where to focus resources. Only later, when additional evidence emerged, would detectives realize how close they had unknowingly been to the man they were searching for. The case also exposed what many later described as missed opportunities within the criminal justice system. Public discussion focused on whether Davis's lengthy criminal record and repeated parole releases should have raised greater concern long before Polly's abduction. Those discussions eventually became part of a much broader national debate about repeat violent offenders, sentencing policies, and parole supervision. Although those debates continued for years, investigators remained focused on one priority: finding evidence that could withstand scrutiny in court. For behavioral analysts, Davis's history reflected several warning signs commonly associated with repeat violent offenders: a pattern of escalating criminal behavior, repeated disregard for legal consequences, prior violent offenses, difficulty complying with parole conditions, and an apparent willingness to take increasingly dangerous risks. It is important to remember that most people with criminal records do not go on to commit crimes of this nature. Criminal profiling is never used to determine guilt. Investigators rely on evidence, not assumptions. In this case, Davis became a suspect not because of his criminal history alone, but because evidence gradually began pointing toward him. As detectives continued re-examining witness statements, forensic findings, and investigative leads, one discovery would change everything. A seemingly routine police encounter, a stolen vehicle, and evidence hidden inside that vehicle would suddenly connect Richard Allen Davis to the disappearance of Polly Klaas. The investigation was about to take a dramatic turn. For the first time since Polly was taken from her bedroom, detectives believed they were closing in on the man responsible. And once they confronted him with the evidence, the search for a missing child would become a race to uncover the truth before it was too late. For weeks, investigators had been chasing hundreds of leads. Every telephone call, every witness statement, every reported sighting, every anonymous tip. Each one offered hope that Polly Klaas might still be found. Yet despite the largest child search operation California had ever seen, detectives remained trapped in the same painful reality. They still didn't know who had walked into Polly's bedroom on the night of October 1st, 1993. But behind the scenes, the investigation was slowly beginning to change. Not because of one dramatic confession, not because of a lucky witness, but because small pieces of evidence, collected by different investigators in different places, were finally beginning to fit together. The turning point began with fingerprint evidence. During the forensic examination of the Klaas home, crime scene investigators had carefully searched every surface the intruder might have touched: doors, furniture, windows, objects inside Polly's bedroom. Several latent fingerprints were recovered and submitted for comparison. At first, investigators could not identify a match. California's fingerprint databases in 1993 were far less advanced than the systems investigators rely on today. Thousands of fingerprint cards still required manual comparison. It was a slow and painstaking process. Detectives knew the prints could eventually identify the offender. The question was whether they could do it before another crime occurred. Meanwhile, another investigation was unfolding just miles away. Only weeks after Polly disappeared, police officers encountered a stolen vehicle during an unrelated investigation. At first, it appeared to have no connection to the kidnapping. Vehicle thefts were common. Officers handled them every day. But when detectives examined the vehicle more closely, they recovered evidence that caught their attention. Among the items connected to the vehicle were materials investigators believed could be relevant to the Polly Klaas investigation. The discovery prompted detectives to look more carefully at the people associated with the stolen car. One of those names was Richard Allen Davis. At that stage, Davis was not yet the primary suspect. He was simply another career criminal whose background deserved closer examination. As detectives dug deeper into his history, additional information began arriving from informants and individuals familiar with Davis. Some reports described his violent behavior. Others mentioned suspicious comments he had allegedly made after Polly's disappearance. Experienced investigators understood that information from informants must always be treated carefully. It cannot replace physical evidence. Every claim required independent verification. Nevertheless, several of those tips encouraged detectives to take a much closer look at Davis. At the same time, officers quietly began surveillance and background investigations. Detectives examined Davis's known addresses, his associates, his recent movements, his criminal history. They wanted to know where he had been on the night Polly disappeared, and whether any evidence could place him in Petaluma. As investigators reviewed witness statements once again, they noticed several details that appeared increasingly significant. Descriptions of the intruder, the timeline, the behavior observed inside Polly's bedroom. When those details were compared with Davis's background and other investigative findings, detectives believed they were beginning to see a pattern. Then came another breakthrough. The fingerprint evidence recovered during the investigation was re-examined alongside known fingerprint records. According to prosecutors, one of the latent fingerprints recovered from the Klaas home was ultimately identified as belonging to Richard Allen Davis. For investigators, it was the strongest lead they had received since Polly vanished. The fingerprint did not stand alone. It was now being considered together with witness descriptions, Davis's criminal history, his known movements, and additional investigative findings. Each new piece of information strengthened the case. Piece by piece, the puzzle was coming together. Detectives who had spent weeks chasing thousands of possibilities now focused their attention on one man. Richard Allen Davis had officially become the primary suspect. Immediately, investigators launched an intensive effort to locate him. Police officers across California received updated information. State and federal agencies coordinated their efforts. Detectives searched addresses where Davis had previously lived. They contacted friends, relative employers, and former associates. Every hour increased the pressure. If Davis realized investigators were closing in, he might disappear. Or worse, he might destroy evidence. The search intensified. Police believed time was once again working against them. Some investigators feared Davis already knew law enforcement was getting closer. If he decided to flee, finding him could become far more difficult. Every road, every contact, every possible hiding place was investigated. The entire case had reached a critical moment. For the first time since Polly Klaas was abducted, detectives believed they knew who they were looking for. Now they had to find him before he vanished again. As police closed in from every direction, one terrifying question remained. Was Richard Allen Davis already running, or was he preparing to make one final mistake that would expose everything? For nearly 2 months, the investigation into Polly Klaas's disappearance had consumed law enforcement across California. Thousands of volunteers had search forests and fields. The FBI had committed significant resources. Detectives had worked around the clock. And now, for the first time since Polly was taken from her bedroom, investigators believed they had identified the man responsible. That man was Richard Allen Davis. But identifying a suspect was only half the battle. Now they had to arrest him. On November 30th, 1993, law enforcement officers located Davis in Ukiah, California. He wasn't hiding in another state. He wasn't living under a false identity. Instead, he was driving a vehicle when officers conducted what appeared to be a routine traffic stop. To Davis, it may have looked like an ordinary police encounter. To investigators, it was one of the most important moments of the entire case. Officers approached cautiously. By this point, they already knew Davis had an extensive criminal history involving violence and weapons offenses. They also believed he could be directly connected to the disappearance of Polly Klaas. There was no room for mistakes. Following standard safety procedures, officers removed Davis from the vehicle and placed him under arrest without a major confrontation. The arrest marked a turning point. For nearly 60 days, investigators had been searching for an unknown predator. Now that predator was in custody. News of the arrest spread quickly. Within hours, television stations across America interrupted their programming. Families who had followed Polly's disappearance since October waited anxiously for answers. Had police finally found the man responsible? More importantly, did he know where Polly was? Those questions became the focus of the investigation. After arriving at the police station, Davis was advised of his constitutional rights before detectives began interviewing him. Experienced investigators understood they were questioning a career criminal. They expected deception. They expected contradictions. And they knew that obtaining the truth would require patience. During the interviews, Richard Allen Davis denied involvement in Polly Klaas's kidnapping. He attempted to distance himself from the investigation and offered explanations for certain pieces of evidence that detectives believed connected him to the crime. As questioning continued, investigators carefully compared his answers with information they had already gathered. Almost immediately, detectives noticed contradictions. His timeline did not consistently match other evidence. Certain details changed during repeated questioning. Some explanations conflicted with witness testimony and physical evidence already collected during the investigation. Although inconsistent statements alone do not prove guilt, experienced detectives understand they can help identify areas requiring further investigation. Rather than confronting Davis emotionally, investigators relied on evidence. They presented information piece by piece. Witness accounts, timelines, forensic findings. Every answer Davis gave was measured against facts investigators already knew. While detectives continued questioning Davis, forensic teams examined the vehicle and property connected to him. The searches produced additional evidence that investigators believed strengthened their case. Every recovered item was photographed, documented, and submitted for laboratory examination. As always, detectives avoided drawing conclusions until scientific testing had been completed. The investigation was becoming increasingly evidence-driven. Each new discovery supported another. Every laboratory result helped clarify the timeline. Every witness statement filled another gap. The focus was no longer simply on proving Davis had entered the Klaas home. Investigators now needed to determine what had happened after Polly was taken. Where had he driven? Where had he gone? Most importantly, where was Polly? As the investigation intensified, detectives from multiple agencies coordinated every step. The Petaluma Police Department, FBI, California Department of Justice, and other law enforcement agencies worked together to verify every detail. Search teams prepared for new operations based on information developed during the investigation. Time remained critically important. If Polly was still alive, every hour mattered. If the worst had already happened, detectives were determined to recover every possible piece of evidence. Across America, the public watched every development. People gathered around televisions hoping the arrest would lead to Polly's safe return. Communities that had spent weeks searching now waited for the next announcement. Hope and fear existed side by side. Many believed the nightmare might finally be ending. Others feared investigators were already too late. For Polly's mother, Eve Klaas, the arrest brought cautious optimism. Someone was finally in custody. But until investigators found Polly, there could be no celebration. Only unanswered questions. Only painful uncertainty. Behind closed doors, detectives continued examining every piece of evidence connected to Davis. Then, during the investigation that followed his arrest, the case took its most devastating turn. Information provided during the investigation led detectives toward a remote location in Northern California. What they found there would end months of searching and forever change the lives of everyone who had hoped Polly would come home alive. The suspect was finally behind bars, but the answer every family feared was still waiting to be discovered in the wilderness of Northern California. For nearly 2 months, America had hoped for a miracle. Every search operation, every press conference, every missing person poster, every candlelight vigil, every volunteer walking through forests and fields carried the same hope that somewhere, somehow, Polly Klaas was still alive. Her mother, Eve Klaas, refused to stop believing. Each ringing telephone brought hope. Each new lead offered another chance. Even as the days became weeks, she continued believing her daughter would come home. Investigators shared that hope, but privately, experienced detectives knew the passage of time was becoming increasingly concerning. Children abducted by strangers are among the most time-critical investigations in law enforcement. The longer a child remains missing, the more difficult the search becomes. Then, following Richard Allen Davis's arrest on November 30th, 1993, the investigation entered its most critical phase. Detectives believed Davis knew exactly what had happened after Polly was taken from her bedroom. The question was whether he would finally reveal the truth. During the investigation that followed his arrest, detectives gathered additional evidence, compared witness statements, and continued questioning Davis. According to court records and investigators' testimony, information developed during the investigation eventually directed law enforcement toward a remote, rural area in Sonoma County, northeast of Petaluma. The location was isolated, surrounded by dense woodland and rugged terrain. It was not a place someone would normally visit by accident. Search teams carefully entered the area. Every step was deliberate. Crime scene investigators knew they were approaching what could become one of the most important discoveries of the entire case. As officers searched the hillside, they made the discovery everyone had feared: human remains. The atmosphere changed instantly. The search operation stopped. The area was immediately secured as a major crime scene. Forensic specialists documented every detail before anything was moved. Photographs were taken, measurements recorded, evidence markers placed throughout the woodland. Every inch of the location was examined with extraordinary care. Investigators understood they might have only one opportunity to recover evidence capable of explaining exactly what had happened. The remains were transported to forensic experts for examination. Because of the condition of the remains after weeks exposed to the environment, scientific identification procedures were required. Dental records, medical records, and forensic comparisons were carefully reviewed. Then came the confirmation no family should ever have to hear. The remains belonged to Polly Klaas. She was only 12 years old. The news devastated her family. For nearly 2 months, Eve Klaas had fought to keep hope alive. She had spoken to the media, thanked volunteers, encouraged search teams, prayed for a miracle. Instead, she received confirmation that her daughter would never return home. The entire nation mourned with her. Across America, millions of people who had followed the case watched the heartbreaking announcement. Communities held memorial services. Schools observed moments of silence. Flowers, letters, stuffed animals, and candles appeared outside the Klaas family home. The little girl whose smile had appeared on television screens across the country had become a symbol of every parent's greatest fear. Following the recovery of Polly's remains, investigators officially reclassified the case. What had begun as a kidnapping investigation had become a murder investigation. Detectives now focused on ensuring that every piece of evidence was carefully preserved for prosecution. Forensic pathologists conducted an autopsy to determine the cause and manner of death. Their findings became part of the official court record and were later presented during legal proceedings. Because of the sensitive nature of those findings, and out of respect for Polly and her family, they were not publicly discussed in graphic detail. Investigators instead concentrated on documenting the evidence necessary to establish what had happened and to support the criminal charges against Richard Allen Davis. At the Woodland crime scene, forensic teams recovered additional evidence. Every fiber, every footprint, every trace of biological material, every object connected to the scene. Nothing was overlooked. Detectives understood that although they had located Polly, their responsibility was far from over. Now they had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt exactly what had happened. As investigators compared the evidence recovered from the crime scene with material already collected during the investigation, the prosecution's case became increasingly stronger. The woodland where Polly had been found would soon become one of the most important crime scenes in modern California history. Every scientific examination, every forensic report, every laboratory result would play a role in bringing her killer to justice. For Eve Klaas, however, none of that could erase the loss. The search for Polly had ended. The search for justice had only just begun. And as prosecutors began preparing for trial, they believed the evidence would tell a story that Richard Allen Davis could no longer escape. The courtroom would soon hear every detail. The witnesses, the forensic science, the investigation, and the overwhelming body of evidence that prosecutors believed proved exactly who had taken Polly Klaas from her bedroom on that October night. Detectives had found Polly, but could they now prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Richard Allen Davis was a man responsible and secure justice for a little girl who never made it home? By the time investigators recovered Polly Klaas's remains, the investigation had entered a completely new phase. The search was over. Now the focus shifted to one critical objective: building a murder case strong enough to withstand a courtroom trial. Detectives knew that arresting Richard Allen Davis was not the same as proving his guilt. A jury would not convict someone because police believed he was responsible. Every allegation had to be supported by evidence. Every piece of evidence had to survive intense examination by defense attorneys, and every scientific finding had to be explained beyond reasonable doubt. The investigation team began organizing thousands of pages of reports collected during nearly 2 months of relentless work. Witness interviews, crime scene photographs, laboratory reports, forensic examinations, search records. Everything had to fit together into one clear and accurate timeline. The prosecution's case would ultimately depend not on emotion, but on facts. One of the most important parts of the investigation was the crime scene analysis. Investigators had actually worked across multiple crime scenes: the Klaas family home, the location where Polly's remains were discovered, vehicles connected to the suspect, and several additional locations identified during the investigation. Each scene was processed separately before detectives compared the evidence collected from every location. Crime scene specialists photographed every room inside Polly's home. They documented entry points, measured footprints, collected fingerprints, recovered trace evidence, and searched for anything the intruder may have left behind. Even the smallest detail could later become a crucial part of the prosecution's case. Among the evidence examined were microscopic fibers. To an ordinary observer, a single fiber appears meaningless. But to forensic scientists, fibers can reveal contact between people, clothing, vehicles, carpets, furniture, and crime scenes. Using powerful comparison microscopes, laboratory experts examined fibers recovered during the investigation. Some fibers matched common household materials and were quickly eliminated. Others became increasingly significant when compared with evidence collected from locations associated with Richard Allen Davis. Although no single fiber could identify a killer, prosecutors argued that the combined forensic findings strengthened the overall case. Another major breakthrough involved fingerprint evidence. During the original examination of the Klaas home, investigators had recovered several latent fingerprints left behind by the intruder. Those prints were carefully preserved and compared against known fingerprint records. According to evidence presented during the trial, one of the latent fingerprints recovered inside the Klaas residence was identified as belonging to Richard Allen Davis. For detectives, this was one of the strongest physical links connecting him directly to the kidnapping scene. Unlike eyewitness testimony, fingerprints provide objective physical evidence. The prosecution argued that the fingerprint demonstrated Davis had been inside Polly's home on the night she disappeared. The defense challenged aspects of the prosecution's interpretation, but the fingerprint remained a central piece of evidence throughout the trial. Investigators also examined shoe impressions recovered from relevant locations. Forensic footwear experts compared patterns, sizes, and manufacturing characteristics with shoes connected to Davis. While footwear evidence alone rarely proves guilt, it can help support other investigative findings by placing a suspect at or near a crime scene. Again, detectives viewed this evidence as one piece of a much larger puzzle. Witness testimony also played an essential role. Polly's two friends courageously described the terrifying moments when a masked man entered the bedroom carrying a knife. Despite their young age and the trauma they experienced, both girls provided investigators with valuable details regarding the intruder's appearance, behavior, and actions. Other witnesses testified about suspicious vehicles, Davis's movements, and investigative findings developed during the inquiry. Each witness added another piece to the timeline. That timeline reconstruction became one of the prosecution's greatest strengths. Investigators carefully traced Davis's activities before, during, and after Polly's kidnapping. They compared witness statements with physical evidence. Telephone records were available, vehicle movements, forensic findings, search records. Every event was placed into chronological order. The prosecution argued that when viewed together, the evidence established a consistent sequence that pointed toward one conclusion. Richard Allen Davis abducted Polly Klaas from her bedroom and later murdered her. Building that timeline required extraordinary teamwork. Detectives, crime scene investigators, DNA analysts, fingerprint specialists, medical examiners, forensic scientists. Every expert contributed to the final prosecution file. Months of investigation were condensed into evidence that could be presented clearly before 12 jurors. As the investigation concluded, prosecutors from the Sonoma County District Attorney's Office carefully reviewed every report. Before filing the case or trial, they examined whether the available evidence could satisfy the highest legal standard in American criminal law, proof beyond a reasonable doubt. After reviewing the investigation, prosecutors concluded the evidence supported multiple serious criminal charges, including kidnapping, first-degree murder, burglary, robbery, and related offenses, along with special circumstances that made the case eligible for the death penalty under California law at that time. The prosecution believed the case was ready. The defense prepared to challenge every piece of evidence. And soon, the courtroom would become the final battleground. A jury would hear weeks of testimony. Scientific experts would explain complex forensic evidence. Witnesses would relive one terrifying night. And Richard Allen Davis would finally face justice for one of America's most heartbreaking child abduction cases. The question was no longer whether detectives believed they had found the killer. The question now was whether 12 jurors would agree. Nearly 8 months after Polly Klaas was abducted from her bedroom, the case entered its most important stage, the courtroom. For Polly's family, this was far more than a legal proceeding. It was a moment they had waited for since the terrifying night of October 1st, 1993. For investigators, it was the opportunity to present months of painstaking detective work. And for Richard Allen Davis, it was the moment he would answer to the charges brought against him. The trial began in Santa Clara County Superior Court after the case was moved from Sonoma County because of the extraordinary media attention surrounding the investigation. The courtroom was filled with reporters, law enforcement officers, legal experts, and members of the public. Interest in the case had become national. Millions of Americans followed each development through television broadcasts and newspaper reports. Everyone wanted to know whether the evidence would finally deliver justice for 12-year-old Polly Klaas. From the very beginning, prosecutors made one thing clear. This case would not depend on confession. It would depend on evidence. The prosecution carefully reconstructed the events of October 1st, 1993. Beginning with Polly's sleepover in Petaluma, jurors heard how 3 young girls had been watching a movie when a masked intruder entered the bedroom carrying a knife. The prosecution explained how Polly was forced from her home while her terrified friends looked on helplessly. From there, prosecutors walked the jury through the weeks-long investigation. They presented physical evidence recovered from the Klaas residence. They explained how detectives followed thousands of leads before ultimately identifying Richard Allen Davis. Rather than relying on a single dramatic piece of evidence, prosecutors argued that numerous independent findings pointed toward the same conclusion: fingerprint evidence, witness testimony, crime scene analysis, the recovery of Polly's remains, and evidence linking Davis to the crime. According to prosecutors, each piece supported the next. Together, they formed a compelling picture of guilt. When it was the defense's turn, Davis's attorneys reminded the jury of one of the most important principles in the American justice system. Every defendant is presumed innocent unless proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense challenged aspects of the prosecution's interpretation of the evidence and argued that jurors should carefully examine every forensic conclusion before reaching a decision. Defense attorneys questioned investigators and forensic experts, testing the reliability of laboratory methods and the significance of certain physical findings. As in every criminal trial, their role was not to prove innocence but to ensure the prosecution had truly met its burden of proof. The courtroom then heard extensive forensic testimony. Crime scene investigators explained how evidence had been collected from the Klaas home. Fingerprint specialists described the identification process that connected Richard Allen Davis to the residence. Forensic scientists discussed trace evidence recovered during the investigation. Medical experts testified regarding the examination of Polly's remains and the scientific findings that supported the prosecution's case. Complex forensic concepts were explained in language ordinary jurors could understand. The trial demonstrated how modern criminal investigations increasingly relied on science rather than speculation. Some of the most emotional moments came when witnesses took the stand. Polly's 2 friends, who had been present during the kidnapping, described the terrifying moments when the armed intruder entered the bedroom. Although years had not passed since the crime, the emotional impact remained profound. Reliving those events inside a crowded courtroom was an incredibly difficult experience. Other witnesses included law enforcement officers, forensic specialists, investigators, and individuals who helped establish the timeline of Davis's movements before and after Polly's disappearance. Each witness contributed another piece of the overall picture. Perhaps one of the most closely watched moments of the trial came when Richard Allen Davis chose to testify in his own defense. Taking the witness stand is a defendant's constitutional right, but also exposes him to cross-examination by prosecutors. During his testimony, Davis denied responsibility for Polly Klaas's kidnapping and murder. Prosecutors questioned him extensively about inconsistencies between his account and the physical evidence presented throughout the trial. Jurors carefully observed every answer, every hesitation, every explanation. As with all testimony, it was ultimately the jury's responsibility to decide what they found credible. Throughout the proceedings, the courtroom remained tense. Each day brought new evidence, new testimony, new arguments. For Polly's family, every session meant reliving unimaginable pain. For investigators, it was the final test of years of work. The prosecution and defense each presented detailed closing arguments. Prosecutors argued that the evidence formed one clear and consistent narrative that identified Richard Allen Davis as the man who abducted and murdered Polly Klaas. The defense urged jurors to examine every piece of evidence carefully and reminded them that the law required proof beyond reasonable doubt before conviction could be returned. The judge then instructed the jury on the law and their responsibilities. With the courtroom silent, the 12 jurors retired to begin their deliberations. For Polly's mother, Eve Klaas, the waiting was almost unbearable. The investigation had lasted months. The trial had examined every painful detail. Now the decision rested entirely in the hands of 12 ordinary citizens. The future of Richard Allen Davis and the search for justice for Polly depended on the verdict they were about to reach. The nation waited, the courtroom waited, and soon the jury would return with a decision that would forever become part of American criminal justice history. The courtroom had fallen silent. After weeks of testimony, months of investigation, and one of the most closely watched criminal trials in America, everything now rested in the hands of 12 jurors. For Eve Klaas, every passing minute felt endless. She had spent nearly a year living through every parent's worst nightmare. First came the kidnapping, then the desperate nationwide search, then the heartbreaking discovery that her 12-year-old daughter would never come home. Now she waited for one final answer. Would the man accused of taking Polly's life finally be held accountable? Behind closed doors, the jury carefully reviewed the evidence. They examined witness testimony, forensic reports, fingerprint evidence, the timeline constructed by investigators, and every argument presented by both the prosecution and the defense. Unlike television dramas, juries are instructed to decide cases based solely on the evidence presented in court, not emotion, speculation, or media coverage. The responsibility was enormous. A conviction would require proof beyond a reasonable doubt. After deliberating, the jury returned to the courtroom. The atmosphere was tense. Richard Allen Davis sat quietly beside his attorneys. Across the room, Polly's family waited anxiously. Reporters filled the gallery. No one spoke. The court clerk asked the foreperson whether the jury had reached a verdict. The answer came back clearly. Yes. The verdict was read aloud. Richard Allen Davis was found guilty of the kidnapping and first-degree murder of Polly Klaas, along with related charges and special circumstance findings. The jury concluded that the prosecution had proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. For Polly's family, the verdict brought overwhelming emotion. There was relief that the man responsible had been convicted, but there was no celebration. Nothing could erase the loss of a 12-year-old girl whose future had been stolen. Justice had been achieved. Healing, however, would take far longer. Following the guilty verdict, the trial entered its penalty phase, as required under California law at that time, because prosecutors had sought the death penalty. During this stage, jurors heard additional evidence and arguments regarding the appropriate sentence. The prosecution argued that the nature of the crime and the circumstances surrounding it justified the maximum punishment available under the law. The defense presented mitigating evidence and asked the jury to consider a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole instead. After considering both sides, the jury reached its decision. They recommended the death sentence. The judge formally imposed that sentence in accordance with California law then in effect. At sentencing, the court spoke about the devastating impact of Polly's murder on her family and the wider community. The judge acknowledged the extraordinary suffering caused by the crime and recognized the extensive efforts of investigators who had worked tirelessly to solve the case. The court emphasized that Polly had been an innocent child who had every right to feel safe inside her own home. Her life had been taken through an act of profound violence that shocked the conscience of the nation. For Eve Klaas, hearing the sentence was an emotional moment. She later explained that no punishment could ever bring Polly back. The empty chair at the family table would remain. Birthdays would pass without Polly. Every holiday would carry the memory of the little girl who never returned home. Justice could punish the offender. It could never restore the child they loved. Outside the courthouse, the verdict dominated national headlines. Television networks interrupted programming with breaking news. Newspapers across the United States published the decision on their front pages. For millions of Americans who had followed Polly's story from the very beginning, the conviction marked the conclusion of one of the country's most heartbreaking child abduction cases. Many praised the determination of the investigators and the courage shown by Polly's family throughout the legal process. The case also reignited national discussions about violent repeat offenders, parole policies, and the protection of children. Yet even after sentencing, the legal process was not over. Under California law at the time, every death sentence received an automatic appeal. This did not overturn the jury's verdict. Instead, it triggered a mandatory review by higher courts to ensure the trial had been conducted fairly and in accordance with the law. Over the years, Davis pursued multiple appeals, as permitted within the American legal system. Those appeals challenged various aspects of the trial and sentence. However, his conviction remained intact. The courts repeatedly upheld the guilty verdict. For investigators, the conviction represented a successful conclusion of months of relentless work. Thousands of interviews, countless forensic examinations, long days and sleepless nights. Every piece of evidence had contributed to one goal: justice for Polly Klaas. But while the courtroom battle had ended, Polly's story was far from over. Her death would soon inspire changes that reached far beyond California. New organizations, new laws, new child safety initiatives, and a legacy that continues protecting children across America to this day. Because although Polly's life ended far too soon, her memory would go on to change the lives of countless others. The conviction of Richard Allen Davis brought justice for Polly Klaas. But for her family, justice alone was never enough. Nothing could restore the future that had been stolen from a 12-year-old girl. Nothing could erase the pain carried by those who loved her. Faced with unimaginable loss, Polly's family made a remarkable decision. Rather than allowing tragedy to define Polly's legacy, they chose to transform their grief into action. Their goal became simple: to help ensure that what happened to Polly would never happen to another child. That decision eventually changed child safety and victims' advocacy across the United States. Shortly after Polly's murder, Polly's father, Mark Klaas, established the Polly Klaas Foundation. The organization was created with a clear mission: to assist families of missing children, educate communities about child safety, and support law enforcement agencies involved in missing child investigations. For parents suddenly facing every family's worst nightmare, the foundation became a source of guidance and hope. It provided practical advice during investigations, helped distribute missing child information, and worked alongside police departments and community organizations throughout the country. The foundation also focused heavily on prevention. Instead of waiting until a child disappeared, it promoted education designed to reduce the risk of abductions. Children were taught age-appropriate personal safety skills. Parents received guidance on family emergency planning, online safety, and recognizing potentially dangerous situations. Schools invited foundation representatives to speak with students and educators. Communities organized awareness events inspired by Polly's story. One heartbreaking case had become a national movement to protect children. Polly's murder also became part of the growing victims' rights movement in America. Throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, victims' families increasingly called for stronger legal protections, better communication from law enforcement, and greater recognition within the criminal justice system. The Klaas family became powerful advocates for those changes. Their message was clear: victims and their families should never feel forgotten once an investigation begins. They deserve compassion, information, support, and a meaningful voice throughout the legal process. One of the most widely discussed political consequences of Polly's case involved California's three strikes law. In 1994, California voters approved the three strikes and you're out law through Proposition 184, following several high-profile crimes involving repeat offenders, including the murder of Polly Klaas. The law significantly increased prison sentences for individuals convicted of serious or violent felonies who had qualifying prior convictions. Supporters argued that repeat violent offenders pose an ongoing danger to the public and that longer prison terms would improve community safety. Critics later raised concerns about how the law was applied in some nonviolent cases and debated its long-term impact on the criminal justice system. Regardless of those debates, there is little doubt that Polly Klaas's murder became one of the defining events that shaped public support for the legislation. Her case fundamentally changed the national conversation about repeat violent offenders and parole policies. Beyond legislation, Polly's story dramatically increased child safety awareness throughout the United States. Parents began discussing personal safety with their children more openly. Schools introduced additional educational programs. Communities strengthened neighborhood watch initiatives. Law enforcement agencies expanded public outreach regarding child abduction prevention. The image of Polly Klaas reminded millions of Americans that child safety required constant attention, not fear, but preparation and awareness. Her case also influenced how authorities responded to missing child investigations. Police departments refined emergency response procedures. Cooperation between local police, state agencies, and the FBI became faster and more coordinated. Investigators increasingly recognize that the earliest hours following a child abduction are often the most critical. Rapid evidence collection, immediate public alerts, specialized investigative teams, interagency cooperation. Many of these practices became standard components of modern child abduction investigations. The lessons learned from Polly's case helped shape those improvements. Her legacy also contributed to broader national reforms in child protection and missing child response. Organizations dedicated to protecting children expanded their educational efforts. Law enforcement training evolved. Advances in forensic science and investigative coordination continued improving the ability to solve child abduction cases. Although no single reform can prevent every tragedy, Polly's case demonstrated how one family's determination could inspire lasting change across an entire nation. For Mark Klaas, advocacy became a lifelong mission. Rather than allowing Polly's memory to fade with time, he continued working with law enforcement agencies, schools, legislators, and communities to improve child safety. His message remained remarkably consistent. Every missing child deserves immediate action. Every family deserves support. And every community shares responsibility for protecting its children. Today, more than 3 decades after Polly disappeared from her bedroom, her name remains recognized across the United States, not simply because of the crime that ended her life, but because her family's courage transformed unimaginable loss into meaningful action. Thousands of families have received support through the Polly Klaas Foundation. Countless children have benefited from safety education inspired by her story. Law enforcement agencies continue applying lessons learned from the investigation. In that sense, Polly's legacy reaches far beyond one courtroom, far beyond one conviction. Her story changed laws, strengthened child protection efforts, inspired victims' advocacy, and reminded an entire nation that behind every missing child case is a family waiting, hoping, and praying for one more chance to bring their child home. The final chapter of this documentary is not about the offender. It is about Polly herself, the little girl America refused to forget, and the enduring legacy she left behind. A legacy measured not by tragedy, but by the countless lives that continue to be protected because her story was never allowed to fade. When the trial ended, the legal questions had finally been answered. A jury had found Richard Allen Davis guilty of kidnapping and murdering Polly Klaas. But for criminal investigators, behavioral analysts, and psychologists, another question remained. What drives someone to commit a crime like this? No psychological profile can fully explain why an individual chooses violence. Only the offender truly knows every thought and decision that led to the crime. However, by studying behavioral patterns, investigators can better understand how dangerous offenders operate and how future crimes might be prevented. It is important to remember that this analysis is not intended to excuse criminal behavior. Its purpose is to understand it. Behavioral experts who later reviewed the Polly Klaas case noted that Davis displayed characteristics commonly associated with repeat violent offenders. Long before Polly's kidnapping, his criminal record showed a pattern of increasingly serious offenses. He had been arrested and convicted multiple times for crimes involving burglary, robbery, assault, and kidnapping-related conduct. Instead of decreasing over time, the severity of his criminal behavior appeared to escalate. Criminologists often describe this as escalating violence. Many offenders begin with property crimes or lower-level offenses before progressing to increasingly dangerous acts. This progression does not occur in every case, and most offenders never commit crimes as serious as murder. However, investigators pay close attention when a suspect demonstrates repeated violence, disregard for the law, and an inability to comply with supervision. In Davis's case, Prosecutors argued that his criminal history revealed a continuing pattern of serious offending over many years. Another question investigators examined was victim selection. Why Polly? According to the evidence presented at trial, there was no indication that Polly personally knew Richard Allen Davis before the kidnapping. Behavioral experts therefore believe she was not targeted because of who she was as an individual, but because she became vulnerable at a particular moment. She was inside a house where only children were present. The offender exploited an opportunity rather than a personal relationship. This distinction is important. Many predatory offenders do not know their victims beforehand. Instead, they search for situations where they believe they can exercise control while minimizing the risk of interruption. In Polly's case, investigators concluded that the offender forced his way into what should have been the safest place imaginable, a child's bedroom. One of the strongest behavioral themes discussed by criminal psychologists is control. Serious violent offenders are often motivated not only by physical violence, but by the desire to dominate another person. Control over movement, control over fear, control over every decision the victim is allowed to make. The evidence presented during trial suggested that the offender carefully controlled the situation from the moment he entered the bedroom. Armed with a knife, he ordered 3 frightened children to remain quiet. He then selected Polly and forced her to leave with him. That sequence demonstrated calculated intimidation rather than impulsive behavior. Criminal psychologists explained that many predatory offenders use fear as a weapon long before physical violence occurs. The goal is complete compliance. Another aspect frequently discussed in this case involves manipulation and intimidation. Rather than creating chaos inside the house, the offender relied on threats to control everyone present. Behavioral analysts often note that experienced offenders understand how fear affects decision-making. Victims may become unable to react, not because they lack courage, but because extreme fear temporarily overwhelms normal thinking. This understanding has influenced modern law enforcement training, emphasizing that victims and witnesses should never be blamed for how they respond during traumatic events. Investigators also examined several risk factors that appeared throughout Davis's history: his repeated criminal convictions, persistent violent behavior, multiple parole violations, difficulty adapting to life outside prison, and a willingness to commit increasingly dangerous crimes despite previous punishment. Experts emphasize that none of these factors alone predict future violent crime. Many individuals with criminal records never commit offenses of this magnitude. Behavioral analysis cannot determine guilt. Only evidence can do that. In this investigation, Davis became the focus because physical evidence and investigative findings pointed toward him, not because of his background alone. For law enforcement, the Polly Klaas case reinforced several critical lessons. The first was the importance of rapid response. Child abductions require immediate action. Every hour matters. The sooner evidence is collected, witnesses interviewed, and search operations launched, the greater the chance of locating a victim and preserving crucial evidence. The second lesson involved behavioral profiling. While profiles cannot identify a specific offender, they can help investigators prioritize leads, understand offender behavior, and allocate resources more effectively. In Polly's case, behavioral analysis supported, but never replaced, the physical evidence gathered by detectives. The third lesson was perhaps the most important. Repeat violent offenders often leave behind patterns, not necessarily identical crimes, but repeated behaviors that reveal increasing risk. Recognizing those patterns early may help investigators intervene before future victims are harmed. The case also strengthened public awareness about child safety. Parents became more conscious of discussing personal safety with their children. Communities expanded neighborhood watch programs. Schools increased education about responding to strangers and emergency situations. These conversations were never intended to create constant fear. Instead, they encouraged practical awareness while reminding families that responsibility for violent crime always lies with the offender, not the victim. Today, the Polly Klaas case continues to be studied in police academies, behavioral science programs, and criminal justice courses throughout the United States. Not because investigators wish to remember the offender, but because understanding how dangerous predators think and operate helps law enforcement protect future victims. Ultimately, the greatest lesson from this case is not about fear. It is about vigilance, preparation, scientific investigation, and the determination to pursue justice no matter how difficult the investigation becomes. As this documentary enters its final chapters, the focus shifts away from the offender once again, back to Polly, back to the legacy she left behind, and to the lasting impact one little girl's story had on child safety, criminal investigations, and countless families across America. When the courtroom proceedings finally came to an end, many people believed the Polly Klaas case was over. The offender had been convicted. Justice had been delivered. The headlines gradually faded. But for law enforcement agencies across the United States, the investigation had only begun to reveal its lasting significance. The case became a turning point in the way America responded to child abductions. It exposed weaknesses, inspired reforms, strengthened cooperation between agencies, and introduced investigative practices that continue protecting children decades later. One of the most important lessons involved cooperation between the FBI and local law enforcement. From the earliest hours of Polly's disappearance, the Petaluma Police Department recognized that the case required resources beyond those of a single city. The Federal Bureau of Investigation quickly joined the search, working alongside local detectives, the Sonoma County Sheriff's Office, the California Highway Patrol, and numerous other agencies. Rather than competing for control, investigators shared intelligence, evidence, and personnel. Daily briefings ensured every agency worked from the same information. Search operations were coordinated. Witness interviews were shared. Forensic evidence moved quickly between laboratories. That level of cooperation demonstrated how successful investigations depend on teamwork rather than individual departments working alone. Today, joint task forces and multi-agency coordination have become standard practice in major child abduction investigations across the United States. The case also highlighted the extraordinary power of community search efforts. When news of Polly's kidnapping spread, thousands of ordinary citizens volunteered to help. Families, students, business owners, church groups, retired police officers, complete strangers. They searched forests, vineyards, parks, fields, and rural roads for weeks. Many brought their own equipment. Others donated food, water, fuel, and supplies. Although volunteers ultimately did not locate Polly alive, their efforts demonstrated something remarkable. Communities can become a powerful force during emergencies. Law enforcement agencies later acknowledged that organized volunteer support, when properly coordinated, can greatly expand search operations while allowing trained investigators to focus on specialized investigative tasks. The investigation also became an important example of the growing role of forensic science in criminal investigations. Crime scene investigators carefully collected fingerprints, fibers, footwear evidence, biological samples, and other trace materials. Nothing was dismissed as insignificant. Every item was documented. Every exhibit was preserved. That meticulous approach allowed prosecutors to build a case supported by objective scientific evidence rather than speculation. The Polly Klaas investigation reinforced a lesson that continues to guide homicide detectives today. Small evidence often solves big cases. A fingerprint left behind, a microscopic fiber, a shoe impression. Individually, each may seem unimportant. Together, they can establish a compelling picture of what happened. Another lasting lesson involved child abduction response procedures. Before the 1990s, some missing child investigations lacked a rapid, coordinated approach now considered essential. The Polly Klaas case demonstrated that every minute counts. Police agencies increasingly adopted policies emphasizing immediate response, rapid evidence collection, early public communication, and swift coordination with federal authorities. Today, investigators treat stranger child abductions as time-critical emergencies from the very beginning. The first hours are recognized as the most valuable opportunity to locate victims safely and preserve crucial evidence. The investigation also influenced broader law enforcement reforms. Police departments expanded specialized training in child abduction investigations. Detectives received additional instruction in interviewing child witnesses, preserving forensic evidence, and coordinating large-scale search operations. Communication between agencies improved significantly. Technology also evolved. Fingerprint databases became more efficient. DNA analysis advanced rapidly. Digital information sharing transformed how investigators work together, although these improvements resulted from many cases over many years. Polly Klaas's investigation became one of the defining examples used to demonstrate why those reforms were necessary. The case also left a lasting influence on future investigations. Law enforcement academies, forensic science programs, and criminal justice courses continue studying the investigation as an example of effective cooperation between detectives, forensic experts, prosecutors, and the community. Students learn not only from the evidence that solved the case, but from the challenges investigators faced along the way. They study how search operations were organized, how witness information was managed, how physical evidence was preserved, and how investigators maintained focus despite overwhelming public attention. Perhaps the most important lesson, however, is one that extends beyond policing. The Polly Klaas case reminded America that protecting children is a shared responsibility. Parents, teachers, neighbors, schools, law enforcement, community organizations. Every group has a role to play. Awareness does not eliminate crime, but preparation, education, and cooperation can reduce opportunity for offenders and improve the chances of a successful response when emergencies occur. The investigation also demonstrated the importance of persistence. There were moments when detectives faced dead ends, false leads, conflicting witness statements, intense media pressure, yet they refused to stop. They re-examined evidence, followed every credible lead, questioned every assumption. That determination ultimately helped bring Polly's killer to justice. More than 30 years later, the Polly Klaas investigation remains one of the most influential child abduction cases in American criminal justice history, not simply because of the tragedy itself, but because it changed how investigators work, how communities respond, and how the nation thinks about protecting children. The lessons learned from Polly's case continue to save time, improve investigations, and strengthen cooperation across the country. And in the final chapter of this documentary, we leave behind the investigation, the courtroom, and the offender. Instead, we remember the little girl whose life inspired those lasting changes, a child whose memory continues to protect others, a daughter whose legacy will never be forgotten. Every criminal case eventually reaches its legal conclusion. The investigation ends. The jury delivers its verdict. The sentence is imposed. The courtroom doors close. But for the families left behind, life never returns to what it once was. For Eve Klaas, the conviction of Richard Allen Davis brought accountability under the law. But it could never bring back her 12-year-old daughter. There would be no more birthdays, no school graduations, no theater performances, no chance to watch Polly grow into adulthood. The future she had imagined for her daughter disappeared on the night of October 1st, 1993, before America knew her name, before her photograph appeared on television screens across the country, before millions joined the search. Polly Klaas was simply a little girl who loved life. She loved acting. She loved making people laugh. She enjoyed sleepovers, school, and spending time with her friends. She had a vivid imagination and dreamed about the future with the excitement only a 12-year-old can have. To her family, she wasn't a headline. She wasn't a famous case. She was a daughter whose smile filled their home with happiness. Those who knew Polly remember her kindness, her curiosity, her creativity. She had a gentle personality that made people feel comfortable around her. Teachers remembered a student eager to learn. Friends remembered someone who included others and brought joy wherever she went. Those memories remain far more important than the tragedy that ended her life. Throughout the investigation, Eve Klaas showed extraordinary courage. She faced television cameras while carrying unimaginable grief. She thanked thousands of volunteers who searched tirelessly for her daughter. She worked closely with investigators, never losing sight of one goal: bringing Polly home. When the heartbreaking truth was finally discovered, she refused to allow grief to become the end of Polly's story. Instead, she chose to honor her daughter by ensuring that Polly's life would continue making a difference. The Petaluma community stood beside the Klaas family from the very beginning. Neighbors organized search parties. Churches held prayer services. Schools offered support to students struggling to understand the tragedy. When Polly's body was found, flowers covered sidewalks. Candles illuminated neighborhood streets. Thousands gathered to mourn a little girl many had never personally met, but all had come to love. The tragedy united an entire community in compassion. Out of that heartbreak came one of Polly's greatest legacies, the Polly Klaas Foundation. Created by her father, Mark Klaas, the foundation has spent decades helping families of missing children, supporting law enforcement, and educating communities about child safety. It has assisted countless families during their darkest moments, provided resources to investigators, promoted prevention through education, and reminded parents across America that awareness can save lives. For many families facing the unimaginable experience of a missing child, the foundation became a source of hope when hope seemed impossible to find. That may be Polly's greatest legacy. Not simply the laws that changed, not only the investigations that improved, but the lives that have been protected because people chose to learn from her story. Her case inspired stronger cooperation between law enforcement agencies, greater public awareness, improved child safety education, and conversations that continue in schools and homes across the United States today. Although no reform can erase the pain of losing Polly, each improvement honors her memory by helping protect future generations. Her story reminds us that child safety is not the responsibility of one parent, one police officer, or one community alone. It belongs to all of us, every teacher, every neighbor, every family, every person who chooses to remain alert and speak up when something feels wrong. The greatest tribute we can offer Polly is not simply remembering what happened to her. It is continuing the work that her family began, protecting children, supporting victims' families, strengthening communities, and refusing to let any missing child be forgotten. Today, more than 3 decades later, Polly Klaas remains one of the most recognized names in American child advocacy, not because of the man who committed the crime, but because of the extraordinary courage shown by her family, the determination of investigators, and the compassion of millions who refuse to stop searching. As we close this documentary, it is important to remember that Polly was never just a victim. She was a daughter, a friend, a classmate, a young girl with dreams that deserved the chance to become reality. Her life mattered. Her memory matters. And the legacy she leaves behind continues to protect children who will never know her name, but whose lives may be safer because of her story. May we never forget Polly Klaas, not because of how her life ended, but because of the love, hope, and lasting change her memory continues to inspire. Polly Klaas went to a simple sleepover expecting laughter, friendship, and an ordinary Friday night. Instead, her kidnapping became one of America's most heartbreaking child abduction cases. While justice ultimately held her killer accountable, Polly's legacy lives on to the countless children protected by the awareness, advocacy, and child safety efforts inspired by her story. She should never be remembered only for the crime that took her life, but for the bright young girl whose memory continues to inspire hope, strengthen communities, and help protect future generations.